On the island of Rügen, on Germany's Baltic coast, there is a building nearly 3 kilometers long. It runs in a single unbroken line along one of the finest beaches in northern Europe. 6 stories of gray concrete and brick facing the sea, window after identical window for what feels like an architectural eternity. It was designed to hold 20,000 holidaymakers at once, every single room with a sea view. It is, after Albert Speer's rally grounds at Nuremberg, the second largest surviving structure built by the Nazi regime. Almost none of those 20,000 intended guests ever set foot inside it. Not one of them spent a single night of vacation within its walls. The building was never finished. The Strength Through Joy program that built it, the Nazi leisure organization that promised the German working class affordable holidays, concerts, and cruises in exchange for their loyalty, never delivered on the promise this building represented. War came first. Then refugees came. Then the Soviet army came. Then the East German military moved in behind barbed wire and kept the public out for another 4 decades. By the time ordinary citizens could finally walk its corridors freely, the dream the building had been built to embody had been dead for half a century, and the building itself was a hollowed, deteriorating ruin that nobody in unified Germany quite knew what to do with. What makes Prora such a genuinely unusual sight in the landscape of European wartime history is not simply that it was never finished. Plenty of Nazi-era projects were interrupted by the war and left incomplete. What makes Prora distinctive is the sheer length of its subsequent afterlife. Nearly 9 decades now, during which the building has been claimed, occupied, stripped, rebuilt, militarized, abandoned, squatted, debated, and finally sold off piece by 4 entirely different political systems in succession. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Occupation Administration, the German Democratic Republic, and reunified Germany. Each regime found its own use for the same long gray shell on the same white sand beach. None of them used it for the purpose its original architect actually drew. This is the story of Prora, a monument to a promise that was never kept, built by a regime that used the idea of working-class leisure as one of its most effective tools of social control, and then turned the half-finished shell of that promise into a barracks, a hospital, a refugee camp, and finally a closely guarded military secret behind the Iron Curtain. The beach is still beautiful, the building is still standing, and the story of what actually happened inside it, and what never happened at all, is one of the strangest architectural biographies of the 20th century. Chapter 1. The Promise of Strength Through Joy. Why the Nazis Built Holiday Camps, 1933 to 1936. To understand why a totalitarian dictatorship would spend a fortune building the largest seaside resort in the world, you first have to understand what Strength Through Joy actually was, and why the Nazi regime considered it one of its most important institutions. The National Socialist German Workers' Party had come to power in January 1933, promising, among other things, to address the grievances of the German working class. One of its first acts in office was to destroy the existing trade union movement, the independent organizations through which German workers had historically negotiated wages, working conditions, and political representation. In their place, the regime created the German Labor Front, a single compulsory organization that absorbed both workers and employers into a single Nazi-controlled structure. Independent collective bargaining ended. Strikes were prohibited. The mechanisms by which German workers had once exercised collective power were dismantled entirely. Having taken away the institutions of worker power, the regime needed something to offer in their place, something that would make ordinary Germans feel that the new system was working in their interest, even as it had stripped them of genuine political and economic leverage. The answer, established in November 1933 under the leadership of the Labor Front's chief Robert Ley, was an organization called Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy. The ambition of the program was to organize the leisure time of the entire German population. It arranged subsidized concerts, theater, performances, and art exhibitions for workers who had previously had little access to such culture. It organized hiking clubs and sporting events. Above all, it organized holidays, affordable package trips, cruises on purpose-built ships, and stays at subsidized resorts, bringing the experience of organized leisure travel to millions of Germans who had never been able to afford a holiday before. By the end of the 1930s, the organization's own published figures showed extraordinary growth. Roughly 2 million people took Strength Through Joy holidays in 1934, and by 1938, that figure had grown more than fourfold, making the organization the largest tourism operator in the entire world by the eve of the war. This was not mere benevolence. Strength Through Joy was, in its own internal conception and its propaganda function, an instrument for binding the German population to the Nazi state through gratitude and material benefit, rather than coercion alone. It was designed to manufacture the sense of a unified people's community, a Volksgemeinschaft, in which class divisions were supposedly dissolved by shared access to leisure, but only for those the regime defined as belonging to that community. The benefits of Strength Through Joy were never universal. They were extended only to Germans, the regime classified as racially and politically acceptable. Those defined as outside the national community, Jews, political dissidents, and others the regime targeted, were excluded from these holidays entirely, and in the worst cases were simultaneously being persecuted, imprisoned, or sent to the concentration camp system that was expanding in parallel with the leisure program. By the mid-1930s, having established cruises, hiking trips, and short stays, the regime's ambitions for Strength Through Joy grew correspondingly larger. Robert Ley, never a man inclined toward modest plans, claimed that Hitler himself had proposed building a network of 5 enormous purpose-built seaside resorts along the German coastline, each one designed to provide tens of thousands of ordinary German workers with a proper holiday by the sea, something that had previously been the preserve of the wealthy. Only one of these 5 planned resorts ever moved from concept to construction. It was to be built on the island of Rügen, on a long, gently curving stretch of white sand known as the Prora between the existing seaside town of Binz and the ferry port to the north. The location offered exactly what the planners wanted: a beach long enough and flat enough to support a structure of genuinely enormous scale, directly on the open Baltic Sea. The choice to attempt only one of the 5 originally announced resorts is itself worth noting, because it illustrates a recurring pattern in Nazi institutional planning. Grandiose, multiply-redundant ambitions announced with full propaganda fanfare, only a fraction of which the regime's actual industrial and financial capacity could ever realistically deliver. 5 seaside palaces for the German worker made for a compelling speech. One genuinely enormous seaside palace, built so slowly that it was still an empty shell when the war began, was what German industrial capacity and wartime priorities actually permitted. The gap between the announced ambition and the delivered reality would become one of the defining features of Prora's entire institutional life, a pattern that, as later chapters of this story show, would repeat itself again and again across every regime that subsequently took control of the site. In early 1936, the German Labor Front announced an architectural competition for the design of this resort, drawing 11 competing submissions from architects across Germany. The winning design came from Clemens Klotz, a Cologne-based architect already deeply embedded in Nazi institutional building projects, the same architect, in fact, who would go on to design the order castles built to train the future leadership cadre of the Nazi Party. Klotz's winning design for the Rügen project was, by any standard, audacious. 8 enormous, nearly identical residential blocks, each 6 stories tall, arranged end-to-end in a single unbroken line stretching 4.5 kilometers along the beach. Every single one of the planned 10,000 rooms would face the sea. The total capacity, when complete, was intended to be 20,000 guests at any one time. Chapter 2. Laying the Foundation, the ceremony, the symbolism, and the scale of ambition, 1936 to 1938. On May 2, 1936, the foundation stone of what was officially named the KDF Seaside Resort Rügen was laid in a large public ceremony at Prora, broadcast nationally on the radio. The date was not chosen at random. It marked the third anniversary, to the day, of the regime's destruction of the independent German trade unions in May 1933, the very event that had necessitated the creation of the Labor Front and, by extension, strength through joy itself. The ceremony was staged with full military pageantry. Units of the German Navy and Air Force were present, and Robert Ley himself delivered the principal speech, presenting the project as the next great triumph of the Nazi social program. The symbolism was deliberate and precise. The regime was choosing to commemorate the anniversary of the destruction of free labor organization by celebrating the construction of a monument to controlled, regime-administered leisure. The message to the watching public was implicit, but unmistakable. We took away your independent unions, and in exchange we give you this. The trade-off at the heart of the entire Strength Through Joy project, political subjugation exchanged for material and recreational benefit, could not have been more starkly enacted than in the choice of that single date. What followed the foundation ceremony, however, was not rapid construction. Despite the grandeur of the launch, actual building work on the foundations did not begin in earnest until April 1938, nearly 2 full years after the stone-laying ceremony. The gap reflects both the scale of the engineering challenge involved in constructing 8 enormous blocks along an exposed stretch of Baltic coastline and the broader logistical strain that the Nazi regime's rapidly expanding rearmament program was placing on German industry, construction materials, and skilled labor even before the war began. Klotz's design extended far beyond the 8 residential blocks themselves. His full plan for the site included accommodation for Reich labor service workers who would staff the resort, separate housing for permanent staff, a complex of swimming facilities, a plant nursery to supply landscaping for the grounds, a bakery to feed the tens of thousands of expected guests, and a vast festival hall designed to seat the entire resort population at once for communal Nazi propaganda events, a building so large that it alone would have dwarfed most ordinary concert halls of the period. The ambition was not simply to build a large hotel complex. It was to build an entire self-contained town, organized around the absolute centrality of regime-administered, ideologically supervised leisure. The architectural style Klotz employed has been noted by later observers for its straightforward functional severity, long, unbroken horizontal lines, repetitive, identical window bays, an absence of applied decoration. It shared more in common, visually, with the international modernist and Bauhaus traditions that the Nazi regime officially despised as culturally degenerate than with the heavy neoclassical monumentalism the regime preferred for its most prestigious public buildings. This stylistic tension, a functionalist, almost industrial design built by a regime that elsewhere denounced functionalist architecture as un-German, has remained one of the more curious footnotes of the building's history. Worth dwelling on here is the broader contradiction this tension exposes about Nazi cultural policy itself. The same regime that closed the Bauhaus School in 1933 denounced its design principles as rootless, internationalist, and incompatible with authentic German values, and drove many of its leading practitioners into exile, nonetheless commissioned and celebrated a building whose visual grammar, repetition, function-led form, and absence of ornament was unmistakably indebted to exactly that despised tradition. The explanation is not difficult to locate once the building's actual purpose is considered. A resort designed to house 20,000 identical strangers, each entitled to an identical sea view, required an architecture of standardization and repetition almost by definition. Ideological purity about architectural style gave way, as it so often did within the Nazi system, to the practical demands of propaganda spectacle and industrial-scale construction. Whatever the regime's official aesthetic preferences, propaganda value and construction efficiency for a project on this scale took precedence over ideological architectural purity. The design was sufficiently celebrated internationally, regardless of its contested ideological pedigree, that the project received the Grand Prix at the 1937 Paris World's Fair, an award presented for the standardized design and its astonishing repetition of 10,000 identical rooms. By the summer of 1939, with construction now moving at considerable pace following the 1938 start, the main residential blocks and several of the central buildings had reached a state that could be described, generously, as substantially built, structurally largely complete, though far from finished in terms of interior fittings, plumbing, heating, and the countless other details that would have been required to actually receive 20,000 guests. The resort that had been announced with such fanfare in 1936, and that propaganda films had spent years promising to the German public as the great reward awaiting loyal workers, was still, in the summer of 1939, an empty concrete shell. It would remain a shell for the rest of its existence as a Nazi project. Chapter 3. The War Arrives, Construction Halts and the First Forced Laborers, 1939 to 1943. On 1 September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. The effect on the Prora construction site was immediate and total. The construction companies working on the resort, along with their materials, equipment, and skilled workers, were reassigned within weeks to projects the regime now classified as essential to the war effort: fortifications, military infrastructure, armaments production. The Grand Vacation Complex that had consumed a staggering 237.5 million Reichsmarks in construction costs by this point was simply abandoned mid-build, its 8 great blocks left standing in varying states of structural completion, their window openings empty, their interiors unfinished concrete and bare brick. Not a single paying holidaymaker had ever stayed there. The seaside resort of the 20,000, celebrated for years in Nazi propaganda films and magazine spreads as proof of the regime's commitment to ordinary German workers, had never hosted so much as a single overnight guest for its intended purpose. It would never do so under the Nazi regime, and, depending on how one defines the building's eventual post-war uses, arguably never would under any regime at all. The site did not, however, sit entirely empty. Even before construction work formally ceased, the regime had begun using forced and coerced labor at Prora, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of abandoned holiday camp. As early as November 1939, Polish prisoners of war captured during the invasion of Poland were put to work at the site performing cleanup and maintenance tasks, housed in barracks erected on the grounds of the unfinished construction project. From the summer of 1943 onward, hundreds of Soviet forced laborers, prisoners captured on the Eastern Front, and conscripted into Germany's wartime forced labor system, one of the largest such systems in modern history, were brought to Prora and set to heavy construction work in the southern section of the site, continuing limited building activity even as the war ground on and Germany's overall resources grew steadily scarcer. This detail matters because it complicates the popular image of Prora as simply a frozen, untouched relic of a vacation that never happened. Behind the unfinished concrete shells where German holidaymakers were never able to relax, prisoners of war and forced laborers from 2 different nations that Nazi racial ideology classified as subhuman were compelled to work, under conditions that were unambiguously coercive and frequently brutal, on a building whose original purpose had been to celebrate the leisure and well-being of the racially favored German worker. The contrast between the building's intended symbolism and its actual wartime function is about as stark as architectural irony gets. It is worth being precise about what this irony actually represents, because it is easy to state it as a clever rhetorical flourish, and move on without registering its full weight. The entire conceptual premise of strength through joy, and of Prora specifically, rested on a racial hierarchy in which leisure, comfort, and bodily well-being were rights, reserved exclusively for those classified as belonging to the German racial community. Polish prisoners of war and Soviet forced laborers, by the explicit logic of the regime's own ideology, were exactly the kind of people Prora's eventual guests were never meant to encounter, let alone depend upon. Yet it was precisely their coerced labor, performed under armed guard and without payment or meaningful consent, that kept even the limited construction progress of the later war years moving forward. The building's entire physical existence, in its final and most substantially completed form, owes something concrete and irreducible to exactly the people its underlying ideology was constructed to exclude and despise. As the war intensified and Allied bombing campaigns against German cities escalated, Prora's enormous, mostly empty shell of a building complex began to find an entirely unplanned use: emergency shelter. Following the catastrophic Allied firebombing of Hamburg in the summer of 1943, an attack so devastating it created a firestorm that killed tens of thousands of civilians in a matter of days, some of the buildings originally intended for resort staff accommodation at Prora were repurposed to house refugees who had lost their homes in the bombing. The Grand Vacation Resort, never used for its intended civilian guests in peacetime, was now sheltering civilians displaced by the catastrophic violence of total war. In 1940 and 1941, the partially completed structures found a second unplanned military use: training facilities for several police battalions, each composed of roughly 800 men, who would subsequently be deployed across occupied Europe to serve behind the front lines. A deployment history that places Prora's buildings, however indirectly, within the broader machinery of Nazi occupation policy in the territories Germany controlled during the war. From 1942 until the war's end, other sections of the unfinished resort were used to train young women as naval communications auxiliaries, integrating the site into the German Navy's wartime personnel pipeline. Strikingly, several of these later wartime uses, training facilities, communication schools, even a hospital, had in fact been anticipated and provisioned for in Klotz's original 1936 architectural competition designs, suggesting that the dual-use military potential of the site had been built into its planning assumptions from a very early stage, regardless of the purely civilian rhetoric used in the regime's public-facing propaganda. This last point deserves particular emphasis because it undercuts any reading of Prora's wartime militarization as simply an unplanned, opportunistic accident of circumstance. If Klotz's original competition-winning blueprint already accounted for training facilities and medical infrastructure that could be activated should the resort's leisure function prove unnecessary or impossible, then the building's eventual transformation from holiday camp to military and refugee installation was not a betrayal of its original design, intent so much as the quiet fulfillment of a contingency that had been built into its planning from the very beginning. A sober, if cynical, acknowledgement on the part of the regime's planners that a project announced to the public purely in the language of leisure and reward might, in practice, end up serving rather different purposes. Chapter 4. The Final Wartime Years: Hospital, Refuge, and the Collapse of the Reich, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, with the war turning decisively against Germany on every front, Prora's role shifted once more, this time toward the most direct kind of wartime medical necessity. A military hospital was established within the complex that year, treating wounded servicemen in a building that had been designed, just 8 years earlier, to host healthy German workers enjoying their subsidized seaside holidays. The juxtaposition between the original architectural intention, leisure, recreation, the celebration of bodily well-being under National Socialism, and the building's actual final wartime use as a treatment center for the catastrophic human cost of the war that regime had started, is one of the more bitterly ironic transformations in the building's history. It is worth pausing on the practical logic that made Prora suitable for this purpose at all. By 1944, German cities were under sustained Allied bombardment, and conventional hospital infrastructure across much of the country was overstretched, damaged, or destroyed outright. Prora offered something most German hospitals could not: enormous unused floor space, structurally sound concrete construction, and a location on a relatively remote Baltic island, comparatively distant from the principal bombing campaigns devastating the Reich's industrial heartland. The very qualities that had made the site attractive to strength-through-joy planners in 1936 — scale, isolation, a long, uninterrupted building footprint — made it equally attractive 8 years later to a military medical command desperately searching for any available space to treat the wounded of a collapsing war effort. There is something almost mathematically precise about this reversal. The planners of 1936 had selected the Prora Vik beach specifically because its remoteness and scale offered freedom from the constraints that a more developed, more populated stretch of coastline would have imposed on their architectural ambitions. By 1944, that same remoteness and scale had become valuable for an entirely opposite reason. Not freedom to build something grand and visible, but freedom from the visibility and vulnerability of Germany's heavily targeted industrial cities. The building's geography, unchanged throughout, simply switched from being an asset for propaganda spectacle to being an asset for wartime survival. As the war entered its final catastrophic phase in late 1944 and early 1945, Germany's eastern territories were being overrun by the advancing Soviet army at extraordinary speed. The mass flight of German civilians from Pomerania, East Prussia, and other eastern regions that were rapidly being absorbed into post-war Poland produced one of the largest forced population movements in modern European history. Millions of German civilians attempting to flee westward, frequently in brutal winter conditions, ahead of the advancing front. Some of the buildings at Prora that had originally been designed for resort staff accommodation were pressed into service yet again, this time providing temporary shelter for refugees fleeing these eastern territories, particularly from Pomerania, joining the Hamburg bombing refugees who had arrived the previous year. The building that had been conceived to embody the regime's confident promise of permanent peacetime abundance for its racially favored citizens ended its life under Nazi control as a shelter for the displaced victims of that same regime's catastrophic military collapse. The scenes that must have played out in those final weeks and months are not difficult to imagine, even where detailed documentary evidence is sparse. Exhausted families arriving from the east with whatever possessions they had managed to carry, finding shelter in unfinished concrete blocks that had never received their intended plumbing, heating, or interior fittings. Wounded soldiers being treated in spaces that propaganda reels had once depicted in mocked-up illustrations filled with sunbathing holidaymakers. The entire grand architectural ambition of 1936 reduced by the brutal arithmetic of total war to its most basic possible function: 4 walls and a roof, however unfinished, standing between desperate people and a Baltic winter. In early May 1945, in the final days of the war in Europe, Soviet troops occupied the island of Rügen and took control of the Prora complex. The Nazi regime that had built it, the war it had started, and the empire it had hoped to rule for 1,000 years were finished within days. The vacation resort that had never hosted a single intended guest was now, formally and finally, the property of an occupying army from the nation. The regime's eastward expansion had been most explicitly designed to conquer and colonize. Chapter 5: Soviet Occupation, Stripped to the Brick, 1945 to 1949. The Soviet occupation that began in May 1945 marked the beginning of Prora's transition from an unfinished Nazi prestige project to something considerably more functional and considerably less glamorous. a military storage depot, and, eventually, a stripped-down resource for raw construction materials. Rügen fell within the Soviet occupation zone of defeated Germany, the zone that would eventually become the German Democratic Republic. In the immediate post-war years, the vast, largely unfinished Prora complex became, in practical terms, simply a warehouse, a place to store materials amid the chaos of post-war reconstruction across the wider Soviet zone. The Soviet military also made the consequential decision to demolish the southernmost of the 8 original blocks entirely during this period, removing one full segment of Klotz's once unbroken 4.5-kilometer design. Beyond outright demolition, the occupying forces also began the systematic extraction of valuable building materials from the remaining structures, a practice common across the Soviet occupation zone in the immediate post-war years, as the USSR sought reparations and resources from defeated Germany in any form available. The logic behind this practice was straightforward and widely applied across the Soviet zone. A defeated Germany owed material compensation for the devastation it had inflicted on Soviet territory during the war, and whatever could be physically removed and repurposed elsewhere, structural fittings, plumbing, usable metal, timber, anything of value, was fair recompense, regardless of the original ideological purpose of the building it was stripped from. At Prora, this meant the buildings were stripped down toward their bare brick shells, their fittings, fixtures, and usable materials removed and presumably redirected elsewhere. The complex that had been built to the very highest standard of finish the Third Reich could produce for an elite propaganda project was reduced, within a few short years of the war's end, to little more than its structural skeleton. There is a particular irony in this phase of the building's history that deserves to be stated plainly. A structure conceived explicitly to project the permanence, abundance, and material confidence of the Nazi regime was, within barely half a decade of its construction beginning, reduced by the army of the nation that regime had most explicitly targeted for conquest to a hollow brick shell, its valuable materials carted away as the spoils of the very war that regime had started and lost. The building's first true completion, in a sense, was not architectural but punitive, the completion of its dismantling rather than its construction. Where the Nazi planners of 1936 had imagined 20,000 satisfied German holidaymakers admiring a finished, gleaming resort, the actual condition of the buildings by the late 1940s was closer to an industrial ruin. Bare brick walls, empty window frames, the wind moving freely through corridors that had never received doors. The refugee population that had been temporarily sheltered in parts of the complex since the war's final chaotic months remained for several years afterward. Some of the sections originally intended for staff accommodation continued to house refugees from the eastern territories that had become part of post-war Poland, people overwhelmingly from Pomerania who had fled or been expelled westward as the post-war borders were redrawn. These refugees were not permitted to remain indefinitely. By 1949, they had been required to vacate the site entirely, coinciding with the formal founding of the German Democratic Republic that October and the beginning of a new chapter in Prora's institutional life, this time as a deliberately secretive component of East Germany's emerging military apparatus. Chapter 6, Behind the Wire, the East German military takes over, 1949 to 1956. The founding of the German Democratic Republic in October 1949 set in motion the gradual militarization of the Prora site that would come to define its identity for the following 4 decades, far longer than the regime that originally built it had even existed. The earliest phase of this militarization came under the Kasernierte Volkspolizei, the barracked People's Police, a paramilitary security force established by the East German state in 1952 that functioned, in practice, as the precursor to a proper national army before East Germany was formally permitted to establish one. The careful naming of this force, a police formation that operated, trained, and was organized as a fully militarized army in all but name, reflected the delicate constitutional fiction East Germany maintained in its earliest years, when the formal rearmament of the defeated nation remained politically and diplomatically sensitive on both sides of the new Cold War divide. Beginning in 1952, the Barracked People's Police, working alongside civilian construction firms, began extending and rebuilding the structurally intact but still largely unfinished blocks of Prora, converting Klotz's hollow concrete shells into functional barracks, accommodation. Because the buildings had been so thoroughly stripped of fittings during the Soviet occupation years, virtually all of the interior and exterior finishing work that gives the buildings their current appearance dates not from the original Nazi-era construction at all, but from this East German rebuilding program of the 1950s, a detail that surprises many visitors who assume the visible fabric of the buildings is a direct, untouched survival from 1939. In a very real architectural sense, the Prora that exists today is at least as much a product of East German military engineering as it is of Clemens Klotz's original Nazi-era design. Two successive authoritarian states, a decade and a half apart, each leaving their own physical fingerprints on the same concrete skeleton. In 1956, the East German state formally established its national armed forces, the National Volksarmee, the National People's Army, universally known by its German initials, NVA. Prora was earmarked from the outset as a significant military installation for this new force, with plans envisioning a garrison of close to 13,000 soldiers stationed across the site, a number that, had it been fully realized, would have meant the complex hosted, in a military capacity, well over half the number of holidaymakers it had originally been designed to accommodate in peacetime leisure. The scale of ambition, in other words, had not diminished between the Nazi and East German eras. What had changed was the purpose to which that scale was to be applied. In practice, the full ambition of housing 13,000 troops permanently on an island location proved operationally impractical. The Cold War military planning of the period placed a premium on troop mobility and flexibility that a fixed island garrison of that scale could not easily provide. Consequently, by the later 1960s, Prora's role within the NVA had shifted toward a more specialized function as a center for military education and training rather than as a mass standing garrison. From 1962 onward, with the introduction of universal compulsory military service in East Germany, and from 1964 with the creation of an alternative form of unarmed military service for conscientious objectors who served as so-called Bausoldaten, or construction soldiers, performing manual labor rather than combat training, Prora's role within the broader East German military bureaucracy continued to evolve and diversify. The presence of conscientious objectors performing construction labor within a complex whose own physical fabric had, decades earlier, been built in part by forced laborers under an entirely different dictatorship, adds one further recursive layer to the site's already tangled institutional history. Two successive East German generations of young men compelled into uniformed state service, some willingly, some as a matter of principled refusal redirected into manual labor rather than combat duty, passed through buildings whose very walls had first been raised, in part, by men who had no choice in the matter at all. The forms of compulsion differed enormously in their severity and moral weight, but the underlying pattern of a powerful state directing the labor and movement of young men through this particular stretch of coastline persisted across regimes that otherwise defined themselves in direct ideological opposition to one another. Chapter 7. The Secret Island. 4 decades behind the wire, 1956 to 1989. For the better part of 4 decades, from the formal establishment of the NVA in 1956 until the collapse of East Germany in 1989 and 1990, Prora existed as a closely guarded, restricted military zone, entirely off-limits to ordinary citizens, and, for obvious Cold War reasons, of considerable intelligence interest to Western observers on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Declassified American intelligence reporting from this period shows that Western agencies were actively monitoring the steady militarization of the eastern section of Rügen Island, tracking the NVA's expanding presence at the former Nazi resort, with evident concern about its strategic significance on NATO's eastern flank. The simple fact that a Western intelligence agency considered the militarization of an old, half-finished Nazi resort building worth a classified intelligence report is itself a telling measure of how completely the Cold War had absorbed and repurposed the physical leftovers of the previous conflict. A building designed to project the soft power of consumer leisure under one totalitarian regime had become, within 15 years, a hard military asset whose troop movements were being tracked by the intelligence services of an entirely different geopolitical confrontation. Within this restricted military zone, specific elite and specialized units made Prora their home over the following decades. Among the most prominent was the 40th Parachute Battalion, an elite NVA airborne unit that was based in one of the complex's blocks from 1960 until 1982, using another block on the site's northern end for urban combat training exercises, soldiers training for close quarters, fighting amid the corridors and stairwells of a building that had been designed, in another political universe entirely, to host families enjoying their subsidized seaside holiday. Other sections of the complex hosted training facilities connected to officer education, including a military medical training program, and, according to some accounts, an officer training academy intended for cadres from Allied foreign militaries within the Warsaw Pact and broader Soviet sphere of influence, a detail that underscores just how thoroughly the building's original civilian purpose had been erased and replaced by an entirely different, militarized, and explicitly internationalist communist function. One block at the southern end of the complex took on a markedly different character beginning in the 1950s. Rather than housing active combat troops, it became a holiday facility for NVA military personnel and their families, meaning that, after a fashion and after a delay of roughly 2 decades, a tiny fraction of the original 1936 vision of Prora as a place of recreation and rest was finally, if only partially, and for an entirely different clientele, under an entirely different political system, realized. The irony of an East German soldier's family enjoying a state-subsidized beach holiday in a building constructed by the Nazi regime, specifically to provide exactly that kind of subsidized beach holiday to loyal citizens of an earlier dictatorship, is one that has not gone unnoticed by historians studying the site's strange, recursive, institutional biography. It is worth dwelling on just how directly this pattern echoes the building's original founding logic. Both the Nazi state and the East German state that succeeded it on this site shared a common political technique: the use of subsidized leisure and holiday provision as a tool for cultivating loyalty among favored constituencies, whether that constituency was defined as the racially pure German worker under National Socialism or the politically reliable military family under socialism. Two very different totalitarian systems, separated by total war and ideological opposition, nonetheless arrived independently at remarkably similar uses for the same physical structure, a coincidence of function that says less about Prora itself than about the recurring appeal, to authoritarian states of very different stripes, of buying loyalty with beachfront accommodation. Throughout this Cold War period, the site remained almost entirely sealed off from ordinary East German citizens, and certainly from the outside world, its corridors and barracks the exclusive preserve of soldiers, officers, and the families of military personnel. The dramatic, mile-long, beachfront silhouette that had once been celebrated in Nazi propaganda films as proof of the regime's commitment to its working-class citizens was, for 4 decades, simply invisible and inaccessible to the German public it had originally and ostensibly been built to serve. Chapter 8. The Wall Falls, the Army Leaves, Reunification and Abandonment, 1989 to 2003. The collapse of the East German state in 1989 and 1990, and the formal reunification of Germany that followed, brought the Cold War military chapter of Prora's history to an end, opening the site to the German public for the first time since the Nazi regime had begun construction more than half a century earlier. What followed, however, was not a swift or triumphant restoration. It was, instead, nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, decay, and political paralysis over what to do with an enormous, structurally complex, and historically toxic Nazi-era building that nobody in the newly unified German state seemed quite prepared to either properly preserve or definitively tear down. The dilemma facing officials in the newly reunified Germany was genuinely difficult, and not merely a matter of bureaucratic indecision. Demolishing the complex outright would have required removing roughly 3 kilometers of reinforced concrete and brick construction at enormous expense, while also raising uncomfortable questions about whether erasing physical evidence of the Nazi past was itself an appropriate response to that past, particularly at a moment when unified Germany was simultaneously working to establish a culture of remembrance and historical reckoning around its Nazi history. Preserving the complex, on the other hand, meant maintaining and eventually repurposing a building whose scale, design, and original propagandistic function made it almost uniquely resistant to comfortable, uncontroversial reuse. There was no obvious civic purpose, no school, no hospital, no government office complex, that naturally fit a building conceived from its first sketch as an instrument of totalitarian leisure control. In the immediate aftermath of reunification, the new unified German government briefly considered converting Prora into a large-scale barracks and training center for the reorganized, reunified German military, a proposal that, given the site's history, attracted understandable controversy and was ultimately not pursued. A more constructive local initiative followed in 1992, when a dedicated preservation foundation, established specifically to safeguard Prora's future, succeeded in having the complex formally declared a protected national historical monument, a designation that prevented demolition but offered no clear roadmap for what productive use the building might serve going forward. For roughly the next decade, the site existed in a strange institutional limbo. Beginning in 1993, with the military finally and completely gone, the empty buildings became subject to opportunistic informal use, vandalism, and slow physical decay. For several years in the mid-1990s, the site doubled, somewhat improbably, as one of the largest youth hostels in the whole of Europe, drawing budget travelers to sleep within the same walls that NVA paratroopers had once occupied. Squatters and local artists also moved into some of the better-preserved sections during this period, establishing informal ceramics workshops, art studios, and small creative enterprises within the cavernous, half-empty blocks. One block, designated the Prora Center, hosted a rotating series of small museums, exhibitions, and gallery spaces between 1995 and 2005, offering visitors fragments of historical interpretation amid the otherwise largely unused complex. This informal, improvised decade of use, backpackers, squatting artists, ad hoc galleries, all coexisting within a structure originally built to project totalitarian discipline and order, represents perhaps the single strangest interlude in the entire building's history. The same corridors that had once echoed with the marching boots of NVA paratroopers, and before that had sheltered desperate wartime refugees, now hosted ceramics classes and backpacker dormitories. The building's enormous unused scale, absorbing whatever improvised civilian life found its way into the vacuum left by the departing military. A 1996 government-commissioned feasibility study examining what could realistically be done with the site proposed an ambitious mixed-use redevelopment concept, combining a senior citizens residential center, youth hostels, private apartments, and commercial retail space into a single coherent plan for revitalizing the complex. The proposal, however, became entangled in the kind of complicated municipal and federal funding politics that frequently afflict major urban renewal schemes in Germany, and was ultimately never implemented in the form originally envisioned. For years afterward, the site continued to sit largely empty and increasingly dilapidated, its future still entirely unresolved, even as its formal protected monument status ensured that wholesale demolition, at least, remained off the table. By the early 2000s, with the comprehensive redevelopment vision having failed to materialize, the federal agency responsible for managing former military and government real estate began instead selling off the individual blocks of the complex piecemeal to private investors, beginning in 2003. This piecemeal privatization would, over the following decade, finally set in motion the slow, block-by-block transformation of Prora, from abandoned Cold War military ruin into something resembling a functioning, if still deeply contested, contemporary tourist destination. Chapter 9. The Long Reckoning. Selling the Ruins, Building New Apartments, 2003 to present. The privatization process that began in 2003 unfolded slowly and unevenly over the following years, with individual blocks of the complex changing hands, attracting and then losing prospective developers, sitting empty and gradually, block by block, finding new commercial purposes that would have been entirely unimaginable to either the Nazi regime that began construction or the East German military that subsequently occupied the site for 4 decades. The transformations that did eventually take hold were strikingly varied, and in some cases strikingly slow to materialize. One block was purchased and converted into a nightclub that operated for several years before closing. Another, acquired by the Federal Real Estate Agency specifically with this purpose in mind, was earmarked for redevelopment as a proper youth hostel. That hostel, intended to formalize and improve upon the improvised hostel use the site had already informally hosted in the 1990s, eventually opened in 2011 in the complex's northern section, alongside a youth campground that had opened a few years earlier. Other blocks were acquired by private developers with ambitions to create high-end private apartments and hotel accommodation, transforming the formerly austere concrete shells whose underlying architectural lines had, by this point, come to be appreciated by some critics for their Bauhaus-adjacent functionalist clarity, into desirable, design-conscious vacation real estate commanding substantial prices on Germany's competitive Baltic coast property market. Not every announced redevelopment plan succeeded. Several proposed hotel and apartment conversions were announced with considerable fanfare in the mid-2000s, only to stall, fall through, or be sold on to subsequent investors before ground was ever broken, reflecting the genuinely difficult commercial and reputational calculus of redeveloping a building whose history could not simply be designed around. This redevelopment has not been without sustained controversy, and the controversy goes to the heart of what makes Prora such a genuinely difficult site to categorize. Critics have pointed out that developers benefit from generous tax incentives tied to the site's protected historical monument status, incentives originally intended to support meaningful historical preservation and public education, while in practice using those same incentives to fund the construction of decidedly upmarket, exclusive private vacation apartments that do little to engage with, explain, or memorialize the building's deeply troubling Nazi-era origins and subsequent Cold War military history. One youth hostel operator at the site has publicly acknowledged feeling no personal responsibility for a history he did not create, while simultaneously stating plainly that he cannot and does not seek to change it. A property developer working on another block offered a more pointed defense, arguing that whatever else might be said about Prora, the building was never actually used by the Nazi regime or its soldiers for its original intended purpose, a technically accurate observation that nonetheless somewhat elides the building's far more troubling wartime use of forced and coerced labor, and its role housing the training and deployment of police units who served in occupied Europe. These competing justifications, the developer's claim of historical distance, the operator's claim of personal non-responsibility, the local mayor's pointed comparison to America's commercial exploitation of Alcatraz as a tourist site, together sketch out the genuinely unresolved ethical terrain that any redevelopment of Prora has had to navigate. There is no straightforward precedent in German memorial culture for converting a site this large, this central to Nazi-era propaganda, and this materially compromised by forced labor, into ordinary, commercially successful holiday housing. Auschwitz is preserved as a memorial. The Nuremberg rally grounds host a major documentation center, alongside their continued, carefully managed public use. Prora has, instead, largely been allowed to become a beach resort again, with serious historical interpretation available a short walk away for those visitors who choose to seek it out, but by no means a mandatory or unavoidable part of the experience for someone simply renting an apartment for a week by the sea. Since the year 2000, a dedicated documentation center has operated at the southern edge of the complex, established by the same preservation foundation that secured the site's protected monument status back in 1992. This center provides serious, carefully researched historical context covering the entire span of the building's use, from its original 1936 conception through its wartime forced labor construction and refugee housing phases to its 4 decades as a secretive East German military installation, explicitly addressing both the original Nazi propaganda purposes behind the project and its subsequent, very different historical chapters. A separate museum dedicated specifically to the National People's Army and its decades-long occupation of the site also operates within the complex, offering visitors a detailed look at the daily life, equipment, and institutional history of the East German military that called Prora home for so much longer than the Nazi regime that originally conceived it. Today, the site that was once the largest secret military installation on a small Baltic island, and before that, an empty, looted Nazi prestige project that never once fulfilled its founding purpose, has become something altogether more mundane and, in its own way, more unsettling. A moderately popular German seaside holiday destination where visitors can rent a sea view apartment, stay at a youth hostel, learn about the building's extraordinary history at the documentation center, and walk along precisely the same kilometers-long beach that the original 1936 Strength Through Joy planners chose, specifically because it was long enough and flat enough to support their unprecedented architectural ambition. The Strength Through Joy resort has, in the most circuitous and historically loaded way imaginable, finally become something resembling a resort, not for the audience or under the regime that originally built it, but a resort nonetheless, on the very same beach, inside the very same unbroken 6-story concrete shell. Chapter 10. What Prora actually means: a monument to a promise. Never kept. The myth of Prora is the abandoned ruin, an enormous, eerie, half-forgotten Nazi building standing empty on a beautiful Baltic beach, a curiosity for urban explorers and dark tourism enthusiasts, interesting precisely because nothing ever actually happened there. That image captures something real about the site's decades of emptiness and uncertainty, but it fundamentally understates just how much actually did happen within and around those walls, across nearly 9 decades of remarkably varied and often deeply troubling use. Prora was never simply abandoned. It was conceived as the largest and most ambitious instrument of a specific and historically significant form of authoritarian social control. The use of subsidized leisure travel, and consumer-style benefits to manufacture popular consent for a dictatorship that had simultaneously stripped its citizens of independent political and economic power. It was built, in substantial part, using the forced labor of Polish prisoners of war and Soviet forced laborers, people the regime's own ideology classified as racially inferior, compelled to construct, brick by brick, a monument to the leisure of the racially privileged. It sheltered civilian refugees fleeing Allied bombing and, later, fleeing the Soviet Army's advance into Germany's eastern territories. The very army whose eventual victory, the entire war that destroyed the regime's plans, had been fought against. It trained police units who were subsequently deployed across occupied Europe. It served, briefly, as a wartime military hospital, tending to the catastrophic human wreckage of the war the regime itself had started. And then, in perhaps its strangest transformation of all, it spent nearly 4 times as long under the control of a communist East German military as it ever spent under the control of the Nazi regime that built it, becoming a closely guarded, internationally monitored Cold War secret, home to elite paratroopers, military medical schools, and, eventually, belatedly, almost as an afterthought, a small slice of exactly the kind of subsidized military family holiday accommodation the building's original architects had once dreamed of providing to an entirely different population, under an entirely different flag. The building's current incarnation as a contested, partially gentrified holiday destination, luxury apartments alongside a youth hostel, a serious historical documentation center alongside ordinary tourist apartment listings, is in some ways the strangest chapter yet. A structure conceived as the largest and most theatrical expression of the Nazi regime's ability to provide its racially favored citizens with mass leisure on an unprecedented industrial scale, has finally, 8 decades later than originally planned, and for an entirely different clientele under an entirely different political and economic system, become something people actually go to enjoy a beach holiday in. Whether that transformation represents a healthy, pragmatic reclamation of difficult heritage, or a troubling commercial whitewashing of a building's genuinely dark history, remains a question that the site's own developers, preservationists, local officials, and visitors continue to argue about, without any clear resolution in sight. What is not in dispute is the building itself, nearly 3 kilometers of unbroken gray concrete and brick, standing on one of the most beautiful beaches in northern Europe, still there, still visible from the sand, still asking the same unanswered question it has been asking since the foundation stone was laid on the 3rd anniversary of the destruction of Germany's free trade unions in 1936. What exactly was this building built to be? Who was it actually built to serve? And what, in the end, did any of the regimes that controlled it actually deliver to the people they claim to be building it for? The promise was never kept. The building is still standing. The beach has not changed at all.